Because of its length, this lecture has been broken into two parts. The first will look at the sociology of race and ethnicity more generally. The second will look at the sociology of race and ethnicity with a specific focus on law enforcement and criminal justice. Let's start with an overview of the diversity of the U.S. population, at least as of the last major census. Non-Hispanic whites still make up the largest racial and ethnic group at about 61.6%, although that's falling fast. Hispanics and Latinos make up the second largest ethnic group at 18.7%. People who identify as Black or African American at about 12.4%. Asians, that's a really large and diverse category. We'll talk about what that means in a second. At about 6%. People who identify as Native American, Native Alaskan, Native Hawaiian, or Pacific Islander at about 1.3%, and people claiming two or more races at about 10.2%. It's only been about 10 years that the census has allowed respondents to claim two or more races, so I think that's probably an undercount of the number of Americans that actually identify as multiracial. The foreign-born population for the entire United States is about 13.7%, meaning people who were born somewhere else and emigrated here either as children or adults. And according to Statista in 2019, about 22% of American homes are homes in which a language other than English is the primary spoken language. If that sounds low to you, remember, you live in or around Harris County, Texas, probably, if you're listening to this lecture, and Harris County, Texas is significantly more diverse than the U.S. population at large. In fact, Houston, Texas is one of the most diverse cities in the United States. These figures are for Harris County specifically, but other surrounding counties that help make up the enormous Houston metro complex are similarly diverse. Within Harris County, non-Hispanic whites make up only 28.7% of the population. Hispanics or Latinos are the largest racial and ethnic group at 43.7%. People who identify as Black or African American at about 20%. People who identify as Asian at 7.3%. Native Americans at 1.2%, and people who identify as two or more races at 2%. Again, that's pretty low. I imagine the actual count of people who identify as multiracial is significantly higher than 2%, but people get used to choosing whichever ethnic group they identify with most on forms like census forms, school applications, things like that. And so this might speak more to habit than actual demographics. Individuals who are foreign-born are slightly over a quarter of the population in Harris County, and homes in which a language other than English is the primary spoken language are close to half, 44.4%. Caucasian or Anglo-whites are still a majority of the population, but this group is shrinking in number nonetheless, in large part because they tend to skew a little older, a sizable percentage of them being part of the aging baby boomer cohort born following the end of World War II. Caucasian white birth rates are also a little bit lower on average. And finally, migration or immigration patterns into the United States tend to draw from very diverse global populations. For this reason, the United States is experiencing a demographic shift toward becoming what sociologists call a majority-minority nation, meaning a nation in which Caucasian whites are no longer more than half the total population. The pie chart on the left shows the U.S. population breakdown in 2020. Caucasian whites are shown in blue, Hispanic or Latino individuals are shown in orange, Black populations in gray, and Asians in gold. On the right, we see census projections for what the U.S. will look like in 2060, given the current trends. We see the Caucasian white percentage of the population falling to about 44%, with other groups, especially Hispanics, increasing their population share. The term minority or minority group can be a little confusing. When sociologists use the term minority, they aren't always talking about total numbers, but rather about power and access to necessary things like good paying jobs, good schools, safe housing in neighborhoods, political representation, and so on. According to a definition coined by Wagley and Harris in 1958, a minority group simply refers to any subordinate group whose members have significantly less power and control over their own lives than members of the dominant group have over theirs. For this reason, for example, women who make up slightly more than half of the total U.S. population are sometimes also referred to as a minority group for the simple fact that they tend to still be more economically disadvantaged compared to men and are less represented in positions of power in our society. Before we can talk about modern race relations in the US and delve into concepts like racial stratification or inequality, it is helpful to look at how these conditions came to be. The black-white color line, the racial hierarchy which segregates blacks or African Americans and whites, is the most salient in U.S. history. It has shaped everything from our laws and politics to our education system to the geography of our neighborhoods and cities. This dividing line also impacted the treatment of racial and ethnic minorities who came later, from the Irish to the Italians, Jews, Latinos, Hispanics, and so many others. So this will be a major focus of this lecture. The idea of white superiority and black subordination is older than the country itself. But how did it start? Where did early colonial Americans come up with the idea that whites should be superior and given more privileges, power, etc., and so-called blacks should be inferiors and given none of those things? Not surprisingly, the institution of slavery played a huge role. One important term to understand is something sociologists call racial formation. Race, at least as we think about it, isn't biological in nature. Sure, groups of humans have differences in things like the color of their eyes or the amount of melanin in their skin, but those physiological differences don't predictably correlate with differences in personality or ability. Racial formation, then, refers to this: the creation of the idea of racial difference in a population, the invention of racial categories within a group of people. For some reason, humans do like to do this. We like carving up our societies into little camps of us and them based on small differences. Some societies use skin color, but not all. For the Nazis in World War II, the difference they cared most about was religious heritage. Other societies use language or culture to invent their own ideas of racial difference. Some have even used things like the size or length of someone's nose. The colonization of the New World and the displacement of native populations brought new settlers from all over the world. A large percentage of these were not free settlers, but enslaved or bonded laborers, both captured African or native workers and indentured servants from Europe. An indentured servant isn't a slave, but they aren't free either. Instead, this describes a person who signs a contract to work for a master for a period of time, usually 7 years, with the promise that they receive food and housing, and then will be released at the end and paid something called freedom dues, money or land to compensate them for their work. Since passage to the American colonies was too expensive for many poor British people who wanted to try their luck in the New World, many traveled as indentured workers instead. In fact, 76% of English migrants to the Virginia colony were estimated to be indentured. The newspaper ad on the right side of the slide lists some of the positions available to potential indentured servants, and not all of it was manual labor. Some people traveled under indenture to do professional work too, such as being a tutor or a surgeon's apprentice. Being an indentured worker was a hard life. Masters would continuously look for ways to extend their workers' contracts or get away with never freeing them at all. For example, if you got sick or broke something, your master might argue he had the right to months or years more of free work as compensation for his expenses. An indentured servant could be beaten by their master, and they had no right to quit or leave. Any indentured servant who tried that, by running away, would result in their master running an ad offering a reward for their arrest and return. This ad from 1835 offers a reward for the capture and return of an Irish servant named Philip, who is described as being an 11-year-old boy. Africans captured in war and sold by rival tribes were also brought to the colonies as bonded laborers. Africans were captured and brought to the U.S. unwillingly, but not always as lifelong slaves, at least in the beginning. And the idea of being sold into indenture by someone else wasn't unheard of either. Parents with too many children to support would sometimes bind children over into indenture, and not necessarily with the child's free will. There was no law legalizing slavery for life at this point, and slavery as a hereditary condition, something you could be born into, wasn't practiced either in the colonial U.S. or in many places outside of it. Early practices or laws governing slavery often held that it was impermissible to enslave someone as a Christian, so a lot of early African slaves converted and then petitioned the courts for their freedom. Some won. Some also got rich enough, eventually, that they became slave owners or masters of indentured servants themselves, and there are surviving court records from the 1600s and 1700s of black slave owners being sued for freedom by their own slaves, for example, or filing lawsuits against neighbors for the theft of a slave. Slavery in the colonies started out as more of a class status than a racial one. The fact that indentured whites and enslaved blacks worked and lived side by side, and often shared similar, usually terrible conditions, caused them to grow closer. Over time, they developed friendships, some intermarried, and some planned rebellions together. For plantation owners, this was a real problem and an ever-present fear. What if your workers, all prisoners, decided to band together to run away, or to kill you? It did happen, and in many parts of the colonies, slave owners were heavily outnumbered by their enslaved workers. This is a map of slave populations compiled from the census of 1860. Shown here is the percentage of enslaved people per 100 inhabitants of each county. The darker the county, the higher the population of enslaved people. Harris County, where Houston is located, was only about 22% enslaved, but surrounding counties, like Fort Bend, for example, had higher populations. Fort Bend was about 67.5% enslaved. Galveston, about 57% enslaved. The deep, dark line along the Mississippi River shows counties that were between 70 and 90% enslaved populations. As many colonies faced rebellions of people in their servant classes, plantation owners realized they could exploit differences in ethnicity to keep servant classes from uniting, a divide-and-conquer strategy. Over time, white servants began to be given more legal rights and privileges than their black comrades. Black servants were punished more harshly than whites, and interracial unions were strictly outlawed. In 1669, Virginia became the first colony to declare that it was not a crime to kill an unruly slave. Later, rights for white indentured servants were codified into law. For example, you could whip a white servant or a black servant, but you had to let the white servant keep his clothes on. Moreover, it was a crime to kill a white servant in the way that killing a black servant was not. This brings us to the story of a man named John Punch. Historians sometimes call him the first official slave in the United States, not because he was the first person of African descent to be captured and transported to the colonies, far from it, but because his is the first time that colonial courts made an official distinction between the treatment of bonded laborers from Europe and those of African ancestry, and the first time an American court legally sanctioned lifelong enslavement. Sometime during the 1630s, 3 indentured servants ran away from a master in the colony of Virginia. One was an African servant known as John Punch. The other 2, recorded as Victor and James Gregory, were European whites. All 3 men were captured and returned, and all faced legal judgment for violating their contract of service. In July of 1640, the Virginia Governor's Council, the court that presided over the case, issued the punishment to the 3 men. The 2 white men were sentenced to whipping and given a 3-year extension to their contracts. Punch, though, was sentenced to slavery under the same man for the rest of his life. Like I said, this is thought to be the first time the court drew an official distinction between the rights and status of black versus white servants. John Punch is famous for one other reason. We think he has a very famous living descendant. Any guesses? Very notable African American. When I ask this in my face-to-face classes, students always guess that it's either Oprah Winfrey or Morgan Freeman, but I'm afraid neither of those is correct. It's Barack Obama, shown here with his father, Barack Obama Sr., and his mother, Stanley Ann Dunham. In July 2012, Ancestry.com published a paper suggesting that Punch was the 11th generation grandfather of Barack Obama Jr. on the basis of both historic and genealogical research and Y chromosome DNA analysis. But how? Barack Obama's father was from Africa. Barack Obama Sr. wasn't descended from American slaves. So the question is, how can Barack Obama Jr., the first black president of the United States, be the 11th order great-grandson of John Punch, the so-called first official slave in the United States? The answer is through his white mother, Stanley Ann Dunham. Here's the story. John Punch was known to have fathered several children through a relationship with a white woman who was free. Again, at that time, sexual and romantic relationships between blacks and whites weren't as strictly policed. Those children grew up free because their mother herself was free. At the time in Virginia, a child's status followed that of the mother, and eventually changed their last name to Bunch. Punch's descendants stayed in Virginia for a time, and then some migrated to Kansas, where Stanley Ann Dunham's great-great-great-grandmother, Anna Bunch, was born. By that time, the family had been intermarrying with and identifying as white for a long time, and family memory of their African ancestor had likely been lost. It was only found when Ancestry began researching Obama's heritage. Later DNA testing of members of Obama's mother's family confirms that there is African ancestry. This is testing of something called non-recombinant DNA research. So it's thought that Barack Obama actually is a descendant of African slaves. In fact, the so-called first slave in the United States, not through his black father, but through his white mother. Because domestic and immigration laws of the U.S. openly discriminated against non-whites up until the 1960s, generations of new immigrants fought to be admitted to the white category. For example, up until the 1950s, you had to be legally white to naturalize, or be granted U.S. citizenship as a non-native-born U.S. resident. Schools and other facilities reserved for so-called whites were also markedly superior to those reserved for quote-unquote colored people. The question was, who got to be considered white and who didn't? Over the decades, U.S. history sees a rash of court challenges from members of various migrant groups, all arguing that they should be considered legally white. And some of those cases made it all the way to the Supreme Court. U.S. v. Thind in 1923 involved an Indian Sikh man who argued that since he was a high-caste individual in India, that should mean he qualified as a white person in the United States. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court disagreed, ruling that people from India, today India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, were not white. Chinese and Japanese nationals were also unlucky in similar court challenges, but other court rulings did grant white status to people of Mexican descent, a case called In re Rodriguez. This is why Hispanics are considered racially white today, by the way, as well as challengers from the Middle East region. A man from what is today Syria and people from what is today Saudi Arabia were found to be racially white in 2 other court cases. If all of this sounds made up and arbitrary, it is. Race is primarily a social construct, after all. That history of court battles over who got to be white left its mark on a society today, though, creating odd maps like this one from the Wikipedia Commons. This is a world map showing U.S. Census categorizations. If your ancestors are from any of the blue regions shown here, you are still considered to be white for the U.S. Census and other statistical tracking systems like the NCIS. The blue regions are most of Europe, except little green Spain, northern Africa, and most of the Middle East. If your ancestors are from the orange regions, you'd be considered black or African American. If the red regions, you're Asian. Huge diversity there, including Pakistan, India, Japan, China, Korea, the Philippines, and Indonesia. The yellow region designates Pacific Islanders. The green regions designate people who are considered racially white but ethnically Hispanic. If your ancestors are Native American, going back to first contact, any of the gray regions, then you are designated as Native American or Native Alaskan. Moving forward to the present, there is both good and bad news. The good news is, though inequality and stratification are still problems in the United States, things are looking better for many Americans. Poverty in the United States has fallen overall since 2010. In 2019, the total rate hit 10.5%, though the COVID pandemic did create massive upheavals that affected many families. One thing that is important to know, a lot of people look at this and get depressed, or it reaffirms stereotypes. People assume that if you are a minority, that must mean you're poor. But remember something. If 25% of Native American households, for example, are below the poverty line, that still means 75% aren't. The takeaway is, racial and ethnic minorities have a higher risk of being impoverished, but the majority still aren't. And we see improvement. Research by a team of sociologists from the University of Virginia looks specifically at Black men in America, because that is one population of people that are often talked about in a really problematized way. When the news talks about Black men, for example, they are so often talking about victims of police brutality, or poverty, or discrimination, or sometimes they talk about how they're more likely to end up arrested or end up in jail. And discrimination and brutality are big issues, but it's also important to remember that most Black men in America end up making successes of themselves. Most will not live their lives in poverty or end up in jail. The share of Black men in poverty has fallen from 41% in 1960 to under 18% today. Second, and more importantly, the share of Black men in the middle or upper class, as measured by family income, has risen from 38% in 1960 to 57% today. In other words, about 1 in 2 Black men in America have reached the middle class or higher. We are going to talk about discrimination today, though, because it is still a factor. Still, though, people who manage to work hard and make a success of themselves are overcoming certain obstacles to do it. Let's look at median weekly earnings, broken down by race and gender. The median is a way to measure the average. It represents the figure in the dead middle of a data set, rather than the mean, which is the sum divided by the total number. Median is usually used for income because income ranges so widely that people at the upper edge and the lower edge can drag it up or down. In 2021, weekly median earnings for a Hispanic woman, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, were about $722. For a Hispanic man, about $100 more. Black women made slightly more than Hispanic women, $832, but less than both Hispanic men and Black men, who earned $862 per week. White women earned an average of $902, whereas white men pushed above $1,000. Perhaps surprisingly, Asian women and men out-earn even whites here. Why do Asian men and women make more? We'll talk about that on the next slide. The important thing from this data is to understand that for the most part, racial and ethnic minorities tend to make less than whites. Why is that? When trying to come up with explanations for why this happens, some people immediately resort to talking about individual factors. For example, people will say, well, maybe racial and ethnic minorities just tend to cluster in lower paying jobs, or are less likely to have access to the kinds of higher education programs. Higher education in this country is expensive after all. That would allow them to access the highest paying jobs. That could be a factor. We're going to talk about others in just a second. Because they tend to be more financially well off than other racial and ethnic minorities in the United States, Asian Americans, again a very simplistic label representing a huge diversity of Earth's population, are sometimes stereotyped as so-called model minorities. People often resort to racial or cultural stereotypes to explain this. They'll say things like, Asians are good at math, or Asians get ahead because they are hard workers. These stereotypes and the model minority myth are actually harmful for several reasons. First of all, nobody likes being stereotyped, even when that stereotype seems more positive. A stereotype, by the way, is defined as an unreliable generalization about all members of a group that does not recognize individual differences between members of that group. Of course, every person is a different person, and most people like being seen for who they are, not as a walking stereotype. Also, the stereotype of Asians as all rich and successful has been historically used to fuel backlash and even hate crimes against Asian communities. Finally, the model minority stereotype is often used to denigrate or run down other minority groups. Members of Black, Latino, or Native American communities may be told, see, look at Asian Americans and how well they are doing. If you just work harder, you'd be as successful as them. One major reason why Asian Americans tend to out-earn even whites has to do with immigration patterns. A high proportion of Asian migrants who enter the United States every year come in on specialty professional visas, i.e., to do jobs in STEM or healthcare, meaning they are highly educated when they first arrive. Highly educated people just tend to make more than people without advanced degrees. It's very difficult to migrate to the United States from a country like Pakistan, India, or China unless you already have family here or you have an advanced degree in a field like STEM or medicine. So yes, Asian migrants are more highly educated because highly educated Asian migrants are the only ones we allow in. In 2011, less than 10% of all Indian citizens in India had university degrees, but of all the Indian-born adults who came here, 78% had at least a 4-year degree. Compare that to U.S. adults, only 31.6% of which had a BA in 2016. Same for Korean and Chinese migrants, and for other groups too. West African migrants are another very educationally elite population. 64% of adult Nigerian migrants, for example, come here with a BA or higher. Still, even though a highly educated migrant working as a computer programmer will make more than your average, say, white guy working in a restaurant kitchen, when you compare apples to apples, we still see evidence of discrimination. A native-born Caucasian computer programmer, for example, still tends to out-earn the guy doing the exact same job in the next cubicle if that guy is a foreign-born migrant. So we looked at data telling us that men out-earn women and whites tend to out-earn members of most other minority groups. We'll talk about why women make less than men in another module. In this module, I want to focus on wage gaps as they affect workers by race and ethnicity. Why do non-white workers, on average, make less than white workers do? Is it that non-white workers are being discriminated against? Or are there other factors, what we might call human capital factors, at play? Again, non-whites tend to be poorer on average. Maybe they're less likely to go to college. College is expensive, after all, and it's the primary route to economic advancement for most people. If it were just that, we'd expect to see, when we control for education, for example, comparing college-educated white workers only to equally educated minorities, wage differences might disappear. Unfortunately, we don't see that. These data look at mean annual income by education levels. It compares wages of workers with professional degrees that are beyond a 4-year degree, by race in one cluster, white shown in blue, Asians in orange, black workers in gray, and Hispanic workers in gold, then workers with BAs, then workers with high school diplomas. Even when we hold education differences constant, we still see disparities. Whites with BAs still out-earn other minorities with BAs, etc. What explains this, and how much of it is driven by old-fashioned discrimination in hiring, pay, or promotions? Before we discuss the impact of discrimination, we should talk about what that means. Sociologists actually recognize different types or patterns of discrimination and note that they can operate very differently. The first is what we call individual discrimination. This is what most people automatically think of when they hear the word discrimination. It refers to an act of discrimination against one person by another, basically an individual act of meanness. If a father refuses to accept his daughter's fiancé because he's a member of a different race, that would be an example of individual discrimination. Individual discrimination can happen to anyone. It can be driven by hatred or what we call homophily, a preference for people like ourselves. If a hiring manager prefers to hire a young man who graduated from the same college he did, was a member of the same fraternity, and likes all the same sports teams, that would be homophily. Structural discrimination is a little bit different. It refers to discrimination that occurs as a result of the normal operations of a society or institution. This type of discrimination may be baked into laws, policies, or traditions of institutions or societies. By the way, structural and institutional discrimination are basically the same thing. Jim Crow segregation in the South would be an example of structural discrimination, but structural or institutional discrimination can also be unconscious or unintentional. A police department that has a height requirement for new officers, say they have to be 5'7" or above, would tend to hire fewer female officers. Women are shorter than men on average, and also fewer minority officers. Statistically, whites tend to be taller than other racial and ethnic groups. Again, intent isn't as important here. You could have a group of the most fair-minded, egalitarian people on Earth, and they can still end up creating biased outcomes, very much without meaning to, if the rules and policies that they write are written in such a way as to advantage some groups over others. We also call this disparate impacts. Outright discrimination in hiring or accommodations based on race or ethnicity is illegal, but only relatively recently so. For this, we are indebted to the victories of the American Civil Rights Movement and their championship of laws like this one, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, a landmark civil rights and labor law in the United States that outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It also ended unequal application of voter registration requirements and racial segregation in schools, at the workplace, and by facilities that serve the general public, known as, quote, public accommodations, things like restaurants, for example. We talked about the distinction between individual and structural or institutional discrimination. The law also recognizes other subtypes of discrimination too. Let's look at de jure discrimination and de facto discrimination. De jure comes from the Latin and it means by law. It's the same root word for words like jury or jurisprudence. De jure discrimination, then, is discrimination or segregation that is enforced by written laws. De facto discrimination is even easier to remember. It means, in fact. De facto discrimination is discrimination or segregation that exists in reality, but is not legally enforced, or may even be illegal. Legislation like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Supreme Court rulings like Brown v. Board of Education pretty much outlawed de jure discrimination based on race in the U.S. But just because something is illegal, that doesn't mean people stop doing it. De facto discrimination is still a factor in things like hiring, pay, housing, law enforcement, and more. The most common way that social scientists study any kind of human experience is through surveys, because the easiest way to understand what people think, feel, or do is just to ask them. Survey data indicate that racial and ethnic minorities in the United States are more likely to self-report having experienced discrimination. 76% of Black respondents and Asian respondents and 58% of Hispanic respondents say they've personally experienced discrimination. Among whites, the percentage is about 30%. But survey data might not tell the whole story. For example, if someone treats you badly or you don't get a job you want, it might be hard to know for sure that your race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, or any other factor is the reason. Likewise, you could be the victim of discrimination and never know it at all. So studying discrimination in modern society might require different methodological approaches, like a well-designed experiment, for example. This experiment is one such example. It's 2 decades old now, but social scientists still talk about it due both to its simple yet effective research design and its shocking findings. In the early 2000s, University of Wisconsin PhD student Diva Pager recruited 4 college students, 2 Black and 2 white, and sent them to apply for entry-level jobs in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The 4 students all wore similar clothing, had similar height, weight, and appearance. Each applicant was given a made-up work history, but one thing was altered. Every day, the 2 Black testers and the 2 white testers flipped a coin, and one of each set was randomly assigned to pretend to have a criminal record. The kid playing the ex-con was supposed to have spent 18 months in prison on a non-violent drug offense. The other applicant was supposed to have a clean criminal record. The next day, they'd switch. Applicants were all supposed to have a good work history otherwise and a high school diploma. What happened? The researcher tracked callbacks and job offers, and she probably expected to find that employees would be less likely to get called back or offered an interview if they had a criminal record. What she wanted to know originally was, what was the impact of a criminal record, even for a nonviolent crime, on hiring, and was it different for Black applicants versus white ones? This is what Pager found. Success, again, was operationalized by callbacks and job offers. So if a prospective employer called back for a second interview, called to offer a job, or offered the candidate the job on the spot, that was logged here. What we see, not surprisingly, is that the pretend felons on the left got fewer callbacks than the same applicants when they were pretending to have clean records. What caught people's attention was the impact of race. It made a difference in both cases. Black applicants to both groups got fewer callbacks. But Pager also found that Black applicants with clean records still got fewer callbacks than felon whites. Meaning in this study at least, the impact of racial discrimination was as strong or stronger in some cases as the impact of discrimination based on criminal record. 6 years later, the same author did an updated version of this study, looking at low-wage workers applying for jobs in New York City. In this case, she dropped the criminal record variable and instead looked at differences in callbacks between white candidates, Hispanic candidates, and black candidates. Again, it was a matched pairs study. 10 men were recruited. All were given identical resumes. All were of similar height, dress, and appearance, and all were actually college grads from New York City. They spent a week being coached in interview skills, and then were sent out to apply for entry-level jobs in the city. 31% of white applicants received callbacks, 25% of Latino applicants received callbacks, and 15% of black applicants received callbacks. This is another classic study on the impact of discrimination, also published in 2002, that in some ways is even simpler than Pager's. This one looked at professional jobs, the kind you get with a college degree. For professional jobs, you don't walk in off the street and ask for an application. In fact, the hiring manager usually doesn't see you at all until you come in for an interview. So race theoretically shouldn't play as much of a factor. Except there are plenty of ways for people to make assumptions about other people's race besides looking at their skin color. This study used first names. Researchers called census data on the names most commonly given to children by parents from different racial groups. We can actually do this. Look at the most popular baby names each year by race of parents. So here, the research team submitted thousands of resumes to employers, resumes which varied only by the first name of the pretend applicant. Half of those names were names that had been popularly given to African American babies born about 20 years before, Lakeisha and Tyrone. The other half were among the whitest baby names given to babies born that same year, including Kristen and Brad. Again, the findings were similar with the exact same resume. Pretend applicants with blacker-sounding first names got fewer callbacks than those with whiter-sounding first names. Okay, but this research is over 20 years old. Hopefully things have gotten better, right? More recent studies have replicated these findings, showing both the persistence of hiring discrimination and maybe some evidence that things are improving somewhat. Klein et al. In 2021 sent 83,000 fake job applications to 108 large companies. Again, resumes varied primarily by how white or black-sounding the applicants' names were. Klein found that for every 1,000 applications, the white applicants got 250 callbacks compared to the applicants with black-sounding names, who got only 230. Still evidence of discrimination, but narrower than what was shown in the findings by Bertrand and Mully and Thien. Klein's sample was big enough that they could look at other things too. For example, they noticed that some companies showed no discrimination whatsoever, while a smaller number, 23 companies in their sample, were responsible for most of the effect noted. The researchers also noted that jobs with more customer or client contact, like sales or customer support, showed more discrimination. That might be an effect of a hiring manager discriminating because she assumes her customers might be racist. Klein's research team looked at other factors too, such as an indication that the applicant might be GLBTQ. This was indicated by a resume that mentioned involvement with GLBTQ plus causes or clubs. They also looked to see if gender-neutral pronouns, like they and them, had much of an effect. Interestingly, in both cases, in this study at least, the effect on that wasn't very significant. Job discrimination isn't just something that affects black job seekers either, though they are often the most common subject of this kind of research. Sonia Kang and her colleagues did a similar study looking at callbacks for both black and Asian job seekers. They found that both black and Asian job candidates got more callbacks, shown in the graph here, when they whitened their resumes, using whiter-sounding first names, for example. They also found that minority applicants reported strategically adding activities or hobbies that seemed whiter. Hiking, kayaking, and snowboarding were all listed as stereotypically white hobbies. Hispanic job applicants likewise received 10% fewer callbacks compared to those with white-sounding names in a paired resume study conducted in 2021. Here, too, the type of job mattered. Latino or Hispanic female applicants didn't see a difference in callbacks when applying for jobs that were female or minority-dominated, being a cook or a secretary, for example, but did see fewer callbacks when applying for non-stereotype congruent jobs, like in IT. Research conducted by Bartkowski in 2018 found similar trends among Muslim and Arab job seekers. Hiring discrimination is important, but it's not the only issue. This next section will talk about discrimination in housing, renting, and home sales. Before the civil rights victories of the last century, geographical segregation of blacks and whites was enforced through Jim Crow laws and strategies like the creation of sundown towns and racially restrictive covenants. Sundown towns were all white municipalities or neighborhoods that practiced a form of segregation by enforcing restrictions excluding people of other races via some combination of discriminatory laws and intimidation and violence. The term came from signs posted stating that colored people, quote-unquote, had to leave the town by sundown, meaning they were invited in during the day, usually to work for a white employer, but would be harassed or arrested if they remained after dark. This practice actually became illegal in 1917, and so property associations began writing racially restrictive covenants into housing deeds instead. This was language which forbade new owners of any house from ever selling that house in the future to anything but a white person. If your house is old enough, you may still see old racially restrictive language in the deed, though it is now unenforceable. Nevertheless, even though discrimination in housing is every bit as illegal as discrimination in hiring, it can be hard to prove and harder to fight. It may also be one reason we still see such marked residential segregation in American communities. This is a census map of the city of Houston showing the racial and ethnic makeup of neighborhoods. Each blue dot represents 50 white residents. Each green dot represents 50 black or African American residents. Each gold dot represents 50 Hispanic or Latino residents, and each red dot represents 50 Asian residents. It's actually pretty interesting, but you can see that while some neighborhoods are pretty well mixed, others remain majority black, majority white, majority Hispanic, and so on. Sociologists are very interested in measuring and studying racial segregation because it can have harmful impacts. One way that sociologists measure segregation is through something called the index of dissimilarity, a measure of racial and ethnic segregation between two groups. Higher scores reflect greater segregation. A city that scored 0 would be perfectly integrated. A city that scored 100 would be completely segregated. You can think of the numbers here as the percentage of people that would have to pack up and move to some randomly chosen house in order to completely mix the city. One thing you may notice is that Houston is among the least segregated of America's large cities, which is good, although Dallas does better. Another important thing, although southern states have a history of Jim Crow laws that were not as prevalent as in the North, cities in the North are often still more segregated residentially. This may be a feature of how anti-black racism in the U.S. sometimes operated differently. There was an old expression used by African Americans during Jim Crow. In the South, they don't care how close you get, so long as you don't get too high. But in the North, they don't care how high you get, so long as you don't get too close. It meant that Southern Jim Crow laws were more about preventing blacks from gaining any kind of power, denying them access to schools, universities, even libraries, preventing them from voting, punishing those who became too economically successful with outright violence. Southern whites didn't mind blacks getting that physically close, though. Many employed black maids and nannies who lived in their homes, cooked all their meals, and even raised their kids for them. White Northerners were different. They didn't react violently to successful black people or do as much to prevent them from gaining a good education or political power, so long as they stayed in their own neighborhoods. Some of this history of different faces of segregation is still seen in our cities today. Why does residential segregation still happen? Every 10 years ago or so, the Department of Housing and Urban Development runs a series of very large paired tester studies in cities all over the United States. A paired test study is similar to the equivalent resume methodology mentioned before. The research team basically hires actors, gives them identical jobs and credit ratings, and sends them to apply for apartments, apply for mortgages, etc. Paired tester studies still show that, compared to whites, most non-whites are still experiencing disparate treatment in housing applications. Nowadays, it tends to take the form of something called steering. If a non-white person asks to see a house in an all-white neighborhood, they aren't refused like they might have been 60 years ago. But if they go to a realtor and simply say, "Show me some houses," realtors will tend to take whites to all-white neighborhoods and non-whites to non-white neighborhoods, and this could be totally subconscious on the part of realtors. Some of this was driven by individual choice. So-called white flight after school desegregation created a pattern of wealthier white suburbs and poorer majority-minority inner cities, as whites left districts with now integrated schools and moved to majority-white areas of town instead. And sometimes minority groups themselves self-segregate. New immigrants, for example, often cluster in so-called ethnic enclaves. This would be like a Chinatown or Houston's Gandhi district. This makes sense for newcomers because they might simply prefer to be in a neighborhood where everyone else speaks their home language and where there are things like restaurants and supermarkets that specialize in the foods they like to eat. However it happens, residential segregation can still cause certain problems, though. Probably you've heard the name of the Supreme Court case that finally struck down school segregation, Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, 1954. But how racially integrated was the school you attended? Was it an equal mix of black, white, Hispanic, and Asian students, or not so much? What about its quality? How nice was it? How new was the building, for instance? How new were the computers in the computer lab? Were their schools nicer than yours? Worse than yours? Why? Even after Brown v. Board of Ed and the civil rights victories of the last century, American schools remain heavily segregated, in large part because neighborhoods themselves are segregated. And public schools in poor neighborhoods are certainly not equal to public schools in wealthy ones. Much of that is driven by the way we fund education. Public schools receive the majority of their funding through local property taxes, meaning districts with high-value homes can raise more money for the schools than districts where housing is cheaper. If that seems confusing, think of it this way. People with big fancy homes pay more property taxes than those with small, run-down homes do. And that might seem fair, but the money raised in the district stays there. And so rich neighborhoods mean rich schools, and poor neighborhoods mean poor schools. This varies by state. Texas schools get about 65% of their revenue through local sources of income. The more the state pays for school funding and distributes it equally, the less of a funding gap that you see between high and low-income schools. Texas schools, though, range from a spend of about $5,000 per student in some districts annually to over $20,000 per student in other districts in the same year. This is huge. Over the course of a year, a large high school serving the lowest income students can see a revenue shortfall of over $1 million compared to a public high school serving the richest students. Why don't we just take everyone's property tax money and distribute it equally? This could be a good example of structural discrimination. Maybe no one is sitting in a room actively plotting to discriminate against poor kids, who are disproportionately likely to be non-white, but a prejudiced outcome happens anyway because of a tradition of funding schools through property taxes and because of housing discrimination that tends to shut poor non-whites into worse neighborhoods. So regardless of why it happens, residential segregation can be harmful, both because the quality of public services, such as education, sanitation, policing, and whatever, tend to be lower in poorer neighborhoods, and because it perpetuates social distance between whites and non-whites. This touches on the work of a social psychologist named Gordon Allport, who argued that simply bringing people together could work to break down prejudice between groups over time, so long as certain conditions were met first. That people had to be of equal status, co-workers or neighbors, for example. If one was in charge and the other was a subordinate, like a homeowner and her maid, it didn't work as well. And they had to be cooperating toward a common goal. 2 students in a class working together on a group project, or neighbors planning a campaign to improve a local park. These qualifications are more likely to be met when we live, work, and go to school together. We talked about discrimination in hiring and housing, but unfortunately, that isn't where it ends. Discrimination in medical care may be harder to spot, and it isn't as well studied, but it has the potential to be an issue of life and death. The data show us that non-whites are at a higher risk of receiving substandard medical care or having their symptoms undertreated or ignored when compared to white patients. Across studies, for example, black patients were found to be less likely to be prescribed adequate pain management when compared to whites. Todd et al. Found that black patients were significantly less likely than white patients to receive analgesics for fractures in the emergency room, despite having similar self-reports of pain. This was the case even with black children. A study conducted in 2015 looked at pain management for children who were recovering from appendectomies and found that physicians were less likely to prescribe any pain management at all when black children reported moderate pain compared to white children, and were less likely to prescribe opiate medications for severe pain when the patient was black rather than white. Black patients with kidney failure were less likely to be told about transplant options were placed on transplant waiting lists, according to a study done in 2003. And Black patients presenting with symptoms of heart attack, in a study done by Aurora et al. In 2018, were less likely to have their symptoms taken seriously or be given adequate testing and treatment. Students often ask what we can do to remedy any of this, and there are techniques and tactics that can be utilized, although again, it depends on the kind of discrimination that we're talking about. Institutional or structural discrimination usually requires some sort of systemic change to fix, because it's a problem in the system itself, i.e., laws, policies, or wide-scale practices need to change. Systemic change is usually brought about through a combination of personal actions, like voting, lobbying, or running for office yourself, and collective actions, social movements, legal challenges, and public education campaigns. Individual discrimination, in contrast, may be addressed very effectively often through bystander intervention techniques. Bystander intervention means recognizing a potentially harmful situation and safely getting involved to help. These can include very simple measures like speaking out, "Hey dude, that's not funny," and or getting help, documenting the situation and making a report to HR, police, or other authorities. This ends the first part of this lecture. The second part of this lecture, broken into two parts because of its length, will address discrimination in law enforcement.